Comparative history is not new. As long as people have investigated social life, there has been a recurrent fascination with juxtaposing historical patterns from two or more times or places. Today, we're going to look at the article Skocpol and Somers, 1980, which begins with that line. As with any article, it's important to try and understand what the authors were attempting to do. In the late 70s and early 80s, some historians had become aware of how dangerous it was to not theorise what they were doing, and a number had realised that they hadn't really considered in a rigorous way what it was they did when they engaged in comparative history. Skocpol and Somers were aware of this and weren't happy with the answers their colleagues had given. They wrote that in trying to theorise a comparative approach, a number of scholars have mistakenly tried to collapse distinct types of comparative history into a single methodological logic. Contrary to this, they argued there are three very distinct methods you can apply to historical data, what they called the triangle of historical comparison. The three types have distinct and often incompatible objectives and logics, and we're going to talk about them now. The first type of comparison they refer to as parallel demonstration of theory. They describe it like this. Historical instances are juxtaposed to demonstrate that the theoretical arguments apply convincingly to multiple cases that ought to fit if the theory in question is indeed valid. To give a concrete example, last year I did an episode about feudalism and how it applied in Indian history. The concept of feudalism is derived from a Marxist theory that societies develop in stages, and obviously you could reasonably ask if that theory is sound. Well, Skocpol and Somers present parallel demonstration as a way of doing that. If you try to apply the theory to both Europe and South Asia, then if it is sound, it will work in both cases. If it is not, then it won't work in one or both. Skocpol and Somers make the point that the latter is actually easier to demonstrate than the former. Parallel comparison does a much better job of demonstrating a theory is invalid, though that's rarely why people use it, than it does of demonstrating that it is valid. But on the pro side, they do accept that applying a theory to multiple case studies can be a very effective way of elucidating and clarifying that theory and showing how it works in practice. The second type of comparison discussed in the article is the contrast of contexts. The general feature of this type of comparison is that it juxtaposes without formally connecting the case studies. That appeals to historians who usually have a strong sense of historical contingency, the idea that phenomena can be understood only on their own terms, or as it's put in the article. What matters more in the contrast-oriented type is that the historical integrity of each case as a whole is carefully respected, for much of the thrust of this variant of comparative history is to suggest that particular nations, empires, civilizations, or religions constitute relatively irreducible wholes, each a complex and unique socio-historical configuration in its own right. Now, this gets a little interesting. The approach is criticised for its tendency towards unacknowledged theoretical assumptions, which I think is a completely fair point. But the article doesn't really offer any pros to balance the cons. The best Skocpol and Somers are able to say of it is it results in rich descriptions. But that would be true without the actual comparison, which raises the perfectly reasonable question, what is the point? Why juxtapose two case studies at all if you think those case studies can only be understood on their own terms? I've done this kind of comparative work with colleagues. I wrote a book called Images of Mithra, which compared different visual representations of the same god across widely different regions in antiquity. It'll be up on the screen somewhere. I'm mentioning it because I get paid royalties for that one, so I thought this was a good moment to plug it. But it also means I think that I'm in a slightly better place than two sociologists like Skocpol and Somers to answer the question, What is it about comparison of contexts that makes it valuable? And to me, the thing that makes it valuable is questions. If I look at a case study that's from a different time and place, it will often raise with me a question about why things work that way. And I'll ask myself, well, why don't they work that way in the other case study? Now, I can't answer that through the comparison. I still have to go back and look at the other case study entirely on its own terms, using its own evidence. But raising a question I might not otherwise think of, that's really valuable. Or at least some people believe that's really valuable. I think the degree to which you find this sort of comparison useful is going to be a function of your relative weight you place on questions versus answers. Again, as sociologists, I think Skocpol and Somers tend to see more merit in answers. But I'm going to show you a clip here of Jonathan Z. Smith, who's a historian of religions, emphasizing that he thinks the really valuable thing are questions.
There are questions, there are answers, and they're how you get from one to the other. And the ones that last are the questions and the how you got there. The answers themselves, as in a way that math teacher is saying, are more fungible, they're interchangeable.
It's too big a subject today to delve into the differences underpinning Smith and Skocpol and Somers' approaches. So instead, let's turn to the third of their categories, macro-causal analysis. In this case, the article uses Skocpol's own work as an example, suggesting this is the type of comparison the authors feel most affinity for. The logic of macro-causal analysis is described with reference to John Stuart Mill's methods of agreement and disagreement, and as an example, I'm going to talk about how this might apply to the origin of coinage. Coinage was invented independently in several places in Asia in the mid-1st millennium BC. If we want to understand why it was invented, we can do so comparatively by asking what features the societies in Lydia, Central South Asia, and China shared in common. This would be the method of agreement. Then we could look at places where coinage was not invented, places like the Fertile Crescent or Central America, and try to find features those places don't share in common with Lydia through China. That would be the method of difference. If we can find a factor that all of the places that invented in coinage have in common, but isn't shared with the places that didn't, then the logic goes, we've found the factor responsible for that historical phenomena. Skocpol and Somers have quite a positive view of this form of comparison. Macroanalytic comparative history has the considerable virtue of being the only way to attempt to validate and invalidate causal hypotheses about macro phenomena. Their point being that it's the only approach that really generates answers. Again, as we just discussed, your evaluation depends on how much answers are what matter to you. Now, before carrying on, I do want to tackle a practical issue that really ought to have been raised in the article. In my table, I just used letters for the factors, but to actually do this for coinage, you would need to define what your factors were. For example, is the society urbanized? Is the state bureaucratic? Are unusual metals available? Is there pre-existing commodity money, trade, market economies, and so on? And that would mean defining precisely what those terms mean in a yes-no sense. And then, in each case, whether the answer is yes or no. In other words, finding a way to reduce all of the messy, complex historical data down to a simple metric that the logic of macrocausal comparison can be applied to. Anthropologists call that process coding. And if you've ever read a case study where they do it, you will see it's not straightforward. It often requires teams of people and creates a lot of ambiguities. It certainly does not respect the integrity of each rich and complex case study. And a lot of historians do not trust it for precisely that reason. Following their description of the triangle of comparison, Skocpol and Somers do spend a bit of time talking about how you might combine them, or use them to give different perspectives. I'm not going to spend time on this section because it's not the main point of the article. The main point they are making is the one we began with, that these things do not gel well. They make different assumptions, have different logics, produce different results, that even if used in the same study, they need to be conceptually separate. As they put it, the apparent need for segregation in order to avoid ambiguity helps to reinforce the overall argument of this article concerning the distinct integrity and reality of each major logic of comparative history. And that's about it. In summary, the article begins by arguing that historical comparison is not a single activity, but an umbrella term for a range of activities, and then outlines, with examples, what it thinks are the three distinct approaches that can be taken. Skocpol and Somers is widely referenced, and it is usually the first thing I would suggest as a reading on historical comparison, because while technical, it is easy to follow. Partly, that is because it's relentlessly positive. In a moment, I will briefly juxtapose it with J.C. Smith's take on the same topic. Smith goes to great lengths to explain why comparison is hard, how people have done it badly, and that negative take makes Smith's work hard going. I'm mentioning that here and now because there will be people out there watching this video who, when I started talking about historical comparison, and I did not begin with J.Z. Smith, will have been screaming at their computers with apoplectic rage that I had not begun in that place. And that's why I didn't do it. Whatever the relative merits of Smith's work, the reality is he's not the right place to start. It's just too complex. And fundamentally too negative. Skocpol and Somers do not downplay the difficulties of comparison, the limitations of the techniques, or even that it's sometimes done badly, but they present it in a consistently positive frame, that it can be done, that it can be done well, and that there is a point to it. This article is the Bob the Builder of comparative methodology.
Can we fix it? Yes, we can!
And that is why it's a good place to start. But I couldn't finish without addressing one very obvious question. If the argument is right, and historical comparison is an umbrella term which conflates various and often incompatible approaches, are Skocpol and Somers' three types, parallel, context and macrocausal, a complete description of the possibilities? Did they miss anything? Are there other types of comparison that this article doesn't cover? Well, since I raised the spectre of Smith, I think it is a useful way to answer this. At about the same time, Smith, independently of them, is writing on exactly the same topic, raising the same problem, and also developing a taxonomy of comparison. Smith's is a fourfold scheme and consists of ethnographic, encyclopedic, morphological, and evolutionary. We don't need to worry about exactly what those mean. The important point is that they do not map onto Skocpol and Somers' divisions, suggesting that Skocpol and Somers' divisions are not a complete list. And that's not the only juxtaposition we could make. There is a really obvious example, and actually it's so obvious that Skocpol and Somers must have known about it, and I suspect the omission was intentional. Because philology, a historical subdiscipline that has never lacked for self-confidence, refers to one of its theoretical approaches as the comparative method. So yeah, Skocpol and Somers' list is not comprehensive, but it is a good place to start, and I think, for now, this is a good place for me to end the episode. Thank you for listening.